Today we're talking about penetration testing, and for episode number 1 I wanted to start right at the very beginning with what is penetration testing and what are the benefits that it can give to a business. The reason that I wanted to start right at the very beginning was I recently stumbled into a statistic which is actually quite surprising for me. Gov.uk official statistics reported that of large organisations, 52% are performing penetration testing. Of all organisations, only 13% are performing penetration testing. Now that is surprising to me because running a penetration testing company and actively being involved all the time with penetration tests leads me to the biased view that surely all companies do penetration testing, or all of the ones that I seem to work with do pen testing, and of course that isn't the case. So for episode number 1, I wanted to start right at the very beginning, talk about the benefits of this kind of security assessment, and how it differs to other security assessments like vulnerability analysis or something more advanced like red teaming. I'm going to do a specific episode in the future on vulnerability scanning and red teaming and the pros and cons of those approaches, but I'll touch on some of the similarities and differences in this episode. So, concise, short description of what is penetration testing. For me, penetration testing is a human-led, scope-restricted, time-limited security assessment aiming to actively exploit vulnerabilities to demonstrate their real-world risk. That is a mouthful, so let's break it down. Scope-restricted assessment. This is an aspect of penetration testing which really for me distinguishes it from something more advanced like red team engagements. Penetration testing is scope restricted in 2 ways. First of all, we're typically given a specific system or group of systems to assess. So during a penetration test, organizations would typically say something like, please assess our mobile application, or please assess our web application, or something like that. Very often this is after, or hopefully just before, but very often after, a new version is released or something like that. So they've got a new version of their website, new version of their mobile app, and they want that testing to make sure that there's no unexpected vulnerabilities, or none of the vulnerabilities that they know about have a higher risk than anticipated. Different to red teaming, where with red teaming you're typically testing an entire organization, so it's going to be a larger number of systems overall, and it might not be scope restricted at all in that way. It might be the case that really anything that belongs to that organization is in scope. Another way that is scope restricted is the technique. Typically with penetration testing, we're limited to 1, sometimes 2, but generally 1 technique. So this would be technical, physical, or social. With technical attacks, that's most of the time what we're focusing on with penetration testing. We're probably just going to be doing technical attacks. Again, this is a distinguishing feature between red teaming and pen testing, where with red teaming, you're much more likely to be doing multi-technique approaches, and with red teaming, it really, generally speaking, should be up to the adversarial team, the red team, as to what technique is deployed, whereas with pen testing, most of the time the customer is specifically asking for a certain technique. We're assessing the security of this system, please use social engineering. We're assessing the security of this aspect of our organization, please use physical access techniques. But most of the time, and for this conversation today, penetration testing, technical attacks against a system. So scope restricted, that's the first action. The second aspect is going to be time limited. With a penetration test, most of the time we agree a scope ahead of time, and that's going to be a number of days. We'll typically break that down into number of testing days and number of reporting days. That really is just an effort estimate. When I'm doing penetration testing, I'm going to report as I go. It makes for a much better quality of life for me than having to suddenly stop at the end of an engagement and write down everything that I've done over the last week. That's awful. Nobody likes reporting days, so we simplify it. Also, for us, there's a benefit to our customers. As soon as we find a vulnerability, we're going to write that up and we're going to display that vulnerability to them within our portal so that they can immediately understand the issue and start working on it. But some pen testing companies have a different approach, and some do a chunk of testing followed by reporting. But I prefer to report as I go. So it's going to be time limited. It's going to be a number of days. This is, of course, distinct from something like continuous security testing, where we're engaging with a company over a longer period of time. It changes the kinds of attacks that we can do, it changes the kind of techniques that we can do, and really, time limited is a bad thing. You wouldn't necessarily want the project to be time limited if you could possibly help it. It is just to do with the way that pen testing is charged, where typically it's consultancy days that you're paying for. So, that's the first part. Scope restricted, time limited. I mentioned active exploitation, looking to exploit vulnerabilities to demonstrate their real-world risk. This is a distinguishing characteristic between pen testing and vulnerability scanning, where most vulnerability scanning is just looking to, where possible, confirm vulnerabilities exist. And in some instances with vulnerability scanning, that can be as simple as checking the self-reported version number from the piece of software. So when we try to log into this system, it declares what version it is. We then check against the vendor's website, what are the known vulnerabilities against this version? And a vulnerability scanner is going to report those. Some vulnerability scanners do go further, and they do active inference to determine whether a vulnerability exists, especially with web vulnerabilities like cross-site scripting and SQL injection. They're relatively safe, and the scanner will be able to play around with that system a lot more. And instead of just relying on signatures, can push more towards active exploitation. But scanners being automation-led are going to be limited. It really is going to take a human to determine when this system gets compromised through this vulnerability, what does that mean? So with vulnerability scanners, very often they grade vulnerabilities in a way that can actually be disadvantageous to customers. One of the things that it's probably going to do for the most part, a vulnerability scanner is going to grade vulnerabilities individually. If this is the only vulnerability that exists, what risk rating would it have? And also, it's going to grade it generically. For most organizations with a generic context, what is the risk of this vulnerability going to be? Penetration testing is distinct from that in two ways. First of all, the pen tester can look at the context of a risk and say perhaps there might be one vulnerability that on its own would be a low risk but can be chained with other actions. So hey, these 3 low risk vulnerabilities, because they're all present, that makes the real world risk to the organization actually much higher because we can chain these vulnerabilities together. That's going to be a big thing. But also we can see how far can we get. Think of something like SQL injection, for example. SQL injections can allow us to extract information from a database. Well, what is the information and how impactful is that to an organization? Are we pulling out marketing analytics and log data? Maybe that's not such a bad thing. It's a vulnerability, yes, but it's lower risk in comparison to if we can extract personal information and then this becomes a PII breach. That's going to be much worse. Potentially one up from that could be if we're able to extract credentials, or credentials in hashed form that we can then recover the plain text passwords for. Could we use those credentials to access other systems? Can we reach those other systems? And you can see with pen testing, we're not only going to look at the vulnerability, but if we exploit this vulnerability, how far can we go? So that really is the benefit of penetration testing. For one thing, being human-led, you're going to get a lower number of false positives because the human can actually check, is this vulnerability exploitable, or is this just an issue with the automation getting confused with some aspect of the system and misreporting something? So is the vulnerability actually there, true positive? If the vulnerability is exploited, how far can you go? And can that vulnerability be chained with other vulnerabilities? Major benefits of penetration testing. So hopefully hearing all of that, it sounds like a really good thing. It's better than alternatives like vulnerability scanning, and it's nice and packaged so you can deploy this to test a system against vulnerabilities in a new version or something like that and find their real world risk. Sounds great. One of the questions that often comes up though, especially for organizations when it's their first pen test, is pen testing ever disruptive? I'd like to start the answer to that question just by saying generally no. Penetration testing is rarely disruptive. And I'd like to leave it there, but I think a lot of organizations would be like, what do you mean by rarely? Rarely is carrying a lot of weight in that sentence. So let's have an example of where pen testing can be disruptive and the ways in which an organization can manage that risk. First of all, penetration testing is going to utilize an application or a system in a way that is different to a normal user. We're going to interact with the system in ways that were potentially unexpected to the developers, and therefore unexpected behavior might occur. In most instances, that's probably just going to be a higher load on the system than would otherwise be produced by a single user. So as long as your system can handle an increased load, or if it scales to handle load, that kind of thing, that's not going to be a problem at all. If it can't, or if the load is more than you anticipated, that risk can still be managed. For example, exchanging contact details with a pen tester so that if an issue is discovered of that nature where, hey, the system load is increasing beyond where we're comfortable, the tester can adjust. Maybe, for example, just doing something very simple like slowing down the speed of the engagement and just pushing out that last day. So extending the project, but running it a little bit slower. Easy way to mitigate that kind of risk. And of course, that's one of the things you want to do when engaging with a pen testing company right at the beginning during your pre-engagement activities. Exchanging contact details. How are we going to talk to each other? If you find a vulnerability, how are you going to let us know about that? Now, with Akimbo, one of the ways that we do that is through our software as a service platform. Everything just gets loaded into the platform. So as soon as we find a vulnerability, it gets reported. If you need to talk to the tester or the testing team, then you can message through the platform, and that works really well. But if you're working with another company and they have a different approach, you may be going to want to exchange at least a phone number or something like that. So if something goes wrong, you can talk to the tester. I mentioned reporting vulnerabilities as well. That's something you're going to want to know about. When do we find out about the vulnerabilities that you find? Because if the tester is going to perform a pen test and then a period of reporting and then quality assurance, and maybe there's a long SLA on that, maybe the pen testing company is going to say something like 10 days after the end of the engagement is when you should anticipate your report. That can be a long time before you find out about those vulnerabilities. That's another thing to talk about as well. Again, for Akimbo, we load it into the platform, but it could be as easy as having a debrief call at the end of every day. Is there anything we need to know about? Is there anything significant, either disruption to the test or a significant vulnerability was found? And you can cover that easily. And then the last thing is changes to the system and potential damage to the system. Damage here really generally meaning modification or deletion of data. It can happen. For example, if your system has a button within it that will purge the database and delete all of the data, there could be a problem with a button like that. Now, if the button is labeled destroy database, because this is a human-led engagement, the risk there is going to be very low. The tester is going to see that button and is going to therefore know not to press it, and should of course then configure their tools to avoid pressing that button. So if they're using some automation tools to gain efficiencies in time, they can configure that tooling so it doesn't press that button, it doesn't hit the button, be it deleting a user, deleting data from the database, or what have you. That's actually pretty common. You can imagine that if we're using automation tools to speed up testing, we're going to want to code that automation tool in such a way that it's not going to press things like the logout button when we're trying to do some testing. So that is the default feature that exists. Hey, this button that deletes all the data, don't push that. The problem occurs if you have buttons that are potentially disruptive or destructive that aren't called delete database, they're called like button 1. If you have generically labeled buttons that have negative impacts, that's something you're going to want to talk to the tester about. And again, covered really, really easily within the pre-engagement activities when you sit down to talk about what is it being assessed, how long is that assessment going to take, what is the goals of this assessment, how is reporting going to work, how are we going to communicate. One of the things to point out is, hey, there's some disruptive buttons here, some things that need to be avoided or tested in a specific way. Now that brings us on to talking about testing in production versus a test environment. Now, this really depends based on the company or organization. For example, if your test environment looks nothing like your production environment, performing a pen test within that test environment is not going to be a good test. So that's something to deal with. But if you're pen testing in production and there is the potential for a small amount of disruption, or if you do have features that can be disruptive to the stability of the system, you're going to want to make sure that you talk to the pen tester about those things. There's some balances that could be had here. Very simply, you could do something like perform testing in the test environment and then confirm those vulnerabilities in production. That works quite well, so that you know that those are going to be real vulnerabilities that impact your systems in their live version and can impact your users. That's something that could be managed quite easily. Or of course, if you're quite a modern company, if you have things like infrastructure as code and you can deploy a clone of your production system really easily, then that's going to be good too. But it's something to talk to the tester about, something to talk about during pre-engagement activities. How are we going to make sure that this assessment actually reflects the live environment as it is today? Because I know a lot of companies either don't have test environments or their test environments aren't that closely reflective of real environments. Something to be caught out by here, so something to bear in mind is, if you are cloning an environment or if you are using a test environment and that doesn't have data within that environment that accurately reflects how the system is being used. So what I'm saying here is the systems as they're deployed, the software, the number of servers, the load balancers, all of that kind of thing is exactly like production, but maybe there's no actual user data loaded into that system. That can still impact testing. For example, if I'm trying something like a horizontal privilege escalation or account takeover, if I'm trying to see if there is a vulnerability to take over another user's account, and I'm the only account in the system, that's going to make that very difficult. There's a lot of things to think about when it comes to making sure that the test is reflective of your actual production environment. But hopefully, in this very quick video, you've got the understanding that penetration testing is a really valuable way of assessing your organization's security and going one step further than simple security assessments like vulnerability analysis and accurately working out what is the real-world risk of some of these vulnerabilities.